Okay, I think we're gonna just start. Well, less people come in. So hi everyone. I see some repeated faces, well, names, I guess. As you know, at this point, probably we wanna have some time at the end for questions, but you can always post your questions in the Q&A section. So you have a button right in your screen, so you can just put them there. Other people can also vote for your questions to be answered first. And then at the end, if you'd like to talk, raise your hand so I can unmute you and you can ask your question directly to the speaker. So Aaron Blaisdell got his bachelor degree in anthropology in sunny Stony Brook, then a master in anthropology too in Kent State University, and then his PhD in sunny Binghamton in experimental psychology in behavioral neuroscience. Then he spent a couple of years in Tufts University as a postdoctoral scholar before joining UCLA to start his lab. Besides the mainstream science that he's doing for a while now in causal reasoning, eating behavior, intelligence, among other topics, Aaron has not forgotten that he lives in LA. As you can see for his many media appearances, he has been in Netflix shows like White Rabbit Project or in Mindfield. He has also participated in many podcasts such as Bad Science, Science Comedy, Born Primal podcast, among others. He's also a great teacher and a dedicated mentor. He's my current postdoc mentor, and I will not be more grateful for this experience. Without further ado, let's hear Dr. Blaisdell's presentation titled Space War Episode 4, A New Hopi.
Well, Valeria, thank you for the kind introduction and mentioning some of those media appearances. Hadn't thought about those in a while. Also, thanks for helping to put together this International Society meeting. Good morning, buenos tardes, konnichiwa to all of our international people, audience participating in this meeting. I'm going to be talking about actually work that started with an interest as an undergraduate in anthropology. I'm not going to talk about that, but that's where the interest in spatial cognition started for me. But then has gone through some very recent developments based on some of the work I've done in the past 20 years, and then some collaborative work that's led to some new developments theoretically. So, without further ado, and those of you who are Star Wars fans will enjoy this first part. Those of you who aren't, go and watch the 1977 movie Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And then this little introduction I'm about to start will make sense to you. So that's my homage to Star Wars, which I grew up with. And so that's the theme I'm using to present the topic of this talk, beginning with episode 1. Now it's Space Wars. And the reason I'm pitching it this way is because there's been this kind of tension between two main primary accounts for spatial cognition or spatial behavior, I should say, not spatial cognition, that's one account, but spatial behavior generally. And historically, this series starts at the turn of the 20th century with rats and mazes. And the work started with Willard Small, who adapted based on the Hampton Court maze, which is a famous maze that people would navigate through, and quite complex. A diagram of it's shown here. He constructed a similar type maze in which rats could navigate through the maze and find food at the center. And in describing, when he was writing up his research, talking about what the rats were doing, he described what they were doing in terms of purposive learning, maybe even imagery, consciousness, these kind of terms that were in vogue among the academics at the time, leading up to the challengers who reacted against these kinds of terminology. And those include people like John Watson, who started to, and Thorndike as well, who started to really challenge these cognitive type human-like descriptions of what the animal behavior, what's causing or driving animal behavior. And rather than talking about imagery, consciousness, or even purposive learning, trying to see how much traction you can get with bottom-up, simple bottom-up associative processes such as stimulus response learning. And so that was the first episode, with the phantom of the Phantom Menace being the ghost in the machine, sort of the mind inside the animal. Now, this tension between the behaviorists and the cognitivists continued and was picked up by Edward Tolman and many of his famous experiments, again with rats navigating mazes, where he showed evidence that he interpreted of rats having expectancies of food, of what they were going to get, building cognitive maps of the environment they're navigating, and learning those maps even without explicit food reinforcement. So what we can call latent learning. Then the Hullians came back and with a counterattack to try and explain Tolman's more nuanced and sophisticated types of behaviors that his rats were showing, using his basically what I think is akin to a back propagation type of learning. And so here this is from one of Clark Hull's papers. Actually, I give you the reference at the bottom, where he talks about a goal gradient hypothesis of maze learning applied to the Tolman type mazes. Why would rats learn to, if they start in the start arm marked with the S here, and if they find food in the end arm marked with the F, and there are two basic routes in this particular maze that the rats could take, over time, over a number of trials of exploring the maze and trying the different routes out, they would settle on mostly using route Y and not route X, route Y being the shorter one. And one of the ways he tried to account for this within a stimulus response framework is by basically suggesting something that nowadays we would call back propagation, where the reward strengthens the stimulus, including the discriminative stimuli found near the end of the maze. And then those acquire value that then back propagate to produce a reward that then reinforces the earlier discriminative stimuli and proprioceptive stimuli from the animal itself navigating the maze, earlier points in the maze. And so it's back propagating along these two paths. And the shorter chain would win out, because with each back propagation, each step, there's a weakening in how much reinforcement is left over to reinforce the earlier segment. And so shorter chains tend to be lead to stronger gradients. And so it was, again, a way of trying to rescue this bottom-up type of process to explain these more sophisticated experiments of navigation in a maze. I thought this, when doing the research for this talk, I found this really cool, cute picture online taken from the American Psychological Association meeting in 1939, showing that Tolman and Hull were, although theoretically opposed to each other, were nevertheless on friendly terms and joking around. Here they are sticking their tongues out for a picture at a conference, and they were on friendly terms with each other. Then in the 70s, scientists started poking around more in the brains of the rats that they were studying in these maze-like tasks. And then, and O'Keefe and Nadell in particular wrote a book summarizing a lot of the work that two of them had led which really seem to establish the hippocampus as being the location of the cognitive map that Tolman had talked about. Tolman coined the term cognitive map. O'Keefe and Nadell said, looks like the hippocampus is the neural locus of that cognitive map. And so this is the revenge of the Sith meaning scientists inside the head. And they propose that there are two systems by which animals learn to navigate. There's what they call the taxon system. And this is the traditional bottom-up process of path integration, beacon homing, and stimulus response learning. And in addition to that, there's the locale system, and this is the more Tolmanian cognitive map-based system, in which the cognitive map is based on hippocampal place cells, head direction cells. More recently, the Mosers had added to this the grid cells in the entorhinal cortex that all play a role in building that internal map, the internal representation of external space, the allocentric external space, where objects are in space relative to each other. And that is the gist of this hippocampus as a cognitive map. So you see that from the turn of the 20th century up until recently, at least the 70s, 80s, when a lot of the work on hippocampus and place cells and head direction cells had started really coming to the forefront of behavioral neuroscience, there's this back and forth battle, if you will, between the more behavioral stimulus response side of things and a more cognitive, top-down kind of rational approach to understanding animal behavior in terms of the types of spatial navigation they're capable of. And this has led to our development of, and a lot of this work I'm going to talk about now is in collaboration with Josef Buchek-Yawa, who was started as a graduate student in France and has recently finished a postdoc in Japan. And actually, I believe now he's about to move to New York City for another postdoc there. But he and I have been in collaboration for a while on some human work on cognitive maps. And I started from the Tolmanian perspective, and he started in his lab from a Tolmanian perspective. And we've kind of come to more of a more open solution where we think that maybe what's going on isn't purely cognitive or purely bottom up, but there's actually kind of they're both systems are available, but in a different way than the way it's traditionally been thought of from the O'Keefe and Nadell perspective. And so we're going to call this model HOPI, which means higher order path integration. And the gist of this model is that spatial relations are initially encoded by way of the bottom-up associative and path integration processes. I'll explain more clearly why we're combining associative and path integration in a little bit. Then once a knowledge base is built up of spatial information, built up through these bottom-up associative processes, spatial inferences, that is inferences about where one thing is relative to another, can be computed in a top-down manner or derived from that bottom-up acquired information to drive novel spatial inferences and goal-directed behavior. We have two papers that recently came out talking about this model, and I give those references here. I can give them again later, and this talk will be online later, so you can go back and look those up if you need. But let me walk through the work that we've done that led to the development of this model. Then I'll present a little bit more detail of this specific model. And then I'm going to give an overview of a study by Bill Roberts and his lab with which is a cognitive map experiment, and then look at how HOPI, the HOPI model applies to that, in contrast to how a place cell, head direction cell based hippocampal cognitive map account would apply to those same data from Roberts, and end with a little bit of future episodes. So I'm going to talk about, just briefly here, 3 studies that I've been involved in some of them. Other colleagues have been involved in other of them, but in 3 different species that show some of the work that has been done from a cognitive perspective on cognitive maps in animals, including in humans. This first one involves pigeons. And I've done this study both with an open field, which is shown here. These are 3 different panels of 3 different phases of training in an open field where the pigeons can walk out and among these cups. I'll explain this in a little more detail in a moment. I did a follow-up to this study with a touchscreen experiment. So we have a few different approaches to studying this question. And what we did was we wanted to know is if we have 2 landmarks, we'll call this T and L because they were a wooden painted T shape and a wooden painted L shaped stimulus placed in an open field. And if there are 24 cups laid in this 4x4 grid, or 16 cups actually. I think it was 16 cups in the real experiment too. So 16 cups in a 4x4 grid. One of those cups on every trial has food and the other 15 don't have food. And the food is buried under some sand. And so the pigeons won't know where the food is unless there's some landmark that could tell them, used as a spatial cue. So in phase 1, we actually placed food in the cup in between the T and the L. So these 2 landmarks could give a clear indication of where the food on that particular trial is. And from one trial to the next, the location of the food and also the T and the L landmarks would change. So if the food was here in this lower cup, the T and the L would be placed next to it. If the food was up there on the trial, the T and L would be placed next to it. So the room cues could not indicate which of the 16 cups was the baited cup on any given trial. Only these internal intramaze cues could give reliable spatial knowledge. Then in phase 2, we remove the L and we only have cue T present, the landmark T. And now we train a new spatial relationship between where T is and where the food cup is. We call that goal 2. And so wherever we place T in this maze, it's the cup down southwest of it that will have the food. So, and we give them many, many sessions with many, many trials until they are reliably looking for food based on that landmark. And then in a final test, we give them the other landmark, L, and we let them freely choose from all the different cups available. And there's no food on these non-reinforced extinction probe trials. And of course, the first thing that we saw pigeons do was looking in this cup here, because during first phase of training, that's where L had a spatial reliably indicated where food was. But we also thought maybe they will look here if they learned the L to T spatial relationship and the T to food spatial relationship. Now what you can see is this is just like with the sensory preconditioning or second order conditioning type of experiment. If there's an association between T and L, including, and let me go over to this memory integration hypothesis. If T and L, if they learn the spatial relationship between them, and the T to a food goal in phase 2, if they learn that spatial relationship, then through a second order conditioning process, they can combine those 2 spatial maps to produce this larger integrated map. And that would tell them that there might be food in this specific cup over here with respect to L at test. So we call that cup I for the integration cup. And we indeed found evidence that the pigeons did check that one a lot more than you would expect based on chance of any of the other cups. The only cup they would check more than that one was A, which makes sense because they had a direct memory of that. I won't go into as much detail about the next 2 studies, but these are very similar studies. This one in Victoria Chimizo's lab in Barcelona. This is rats navigating in a Morris water maze. So there's a platform hidden just under the surface of the maze because the water is opaque. And so they can't see where the platform is. You put the rat into the water maze, they swim around until they find the platform, and then they escape from swimming by staying on the platform. The first phase of training for them to learn to find where the platform is had these 3 cues that were on the walls outside of the maze, cues A, B, and C, just 3 different like geometric colored shapes on the walls. And then in the second phase, they learned to find a platform in the presence of 3 new cues, well, 2 new cues, and a third that was similar was part of the first set. So if they learned the spatial relationship between A, B, and C, and then they learned the spatial relationship between C, D, and E, because C is a common element to both of those spatial representations of spatial maps, they could combine that spatial knowledge such that if you give the rat only A and only E, they should be much better at finding the platform compared to rats that had both of these phases of training, but without C. So if they had just a control group had only A and B in phase 1 and only D and E in phase 2, at the AE test, they were much more closer to chance in finding in which quadrant they chose to swim in. Compared to this experimental group, they were much higher rates in that quadrant. So it looked like by having an element that can combine spatial maps is critical to this integration process. And one final study along the same lines of this was a human study with humans navigating a virtual maze. And this is a top-down view of what the maze looked like. And humans start in a room and they can navigate into one direction or another down these hallways. And they could find, and just to learn the layout of the maze through navigating through that space in the virtual maze. Then in the second phase, they're given separate trials on which sometimes starting from the left side, this end box here, and now there's the old door going back is closed, but a new door opens up, allowing them to continue on and discover a new area where there's no reinforcement. And sometimes they're placed in the other arm, and again, with the old pathway closed off, but a new pathway made available, and they find a reward when they get to the end. And then when we test them on the original maze again, they seem to have, they act as if they've integrated these 2 different parts of the maze that they've experienced separately, but with this common connecting part, such that now they make choices as if they understand which way to go to get to the reward from this initial starting point. So all of these are very much like sensory preconditioning type associative experiments, but showing that spatial information is being encoded as part of these associations. And the associative process of integrating, like second order conditioning, is integrating the spatial information that is embedded within those associations. And this has led, some thinking about this has led us to an update in how we're thinking about these processes and the breadth of the type of data that these processes can operate on. So remember, I mentioned earlier that path integration is a real basic low-level process that invertebrates as well as vertebrates seem to show evidence of using when they're navigating space. Is one of the processes available. And what we're suggesting is that what happens is path integration is actually a process that allows for the encoding of allocentric vectors. That is vectors, which is distance and direction between all observed locations or all observed objects within space. And that can occur either through egocentric navigation, like navigating through space. You come across different objects, and then you can update where those objects are in an unfolding map in a Cartesian coordinate system. Or even with things like eye motion or head motion, looking at one object and then looking over in a different direction, seeing another object, that constitutes a kind of motion upon which path integration can occur in the visual field, and allowing for maps between stimuli like landmarks in allocentric space without the egocentric movement through space. And so these 2 processes are this kind of bottom-up associative path integration process. And this results in direct vectors. So if an animal's gone directly from D to B or B to D, they have encoded the spatial vector between those objects. Then once you have multiple direct vectors, they can be combined with, if there's a common element, they combine to form first and higher order derived vectors. So these are vectors that are computed based on the current information of vectors stored in memory. And new ones can be computed. So if a rat had access to area D, C, and B with straight alley paths, and this is the Roberts experiment I'm going to talk about next, is set up this way, then with those three places being experienced, they can derive a first order vector between C and B. Likewise, if, oh, that's actually, let me show, that's here. If they've had only between B and C going through a common center pathway, they can develop a derived vector from that. If then they get additional training, they can use earlier derived vectors and direct vectors to produce second order derived vectors. If this is sounding a little complex, let me explain it better by walking us through the Roberts 2007 study. So this is with rats. This is a top-down schematic of a plus maze. This is a barrier here, this solid line. So initially, rats are given opportunities to go from the end wall D, end box D to end box A to end box B, uninhibited. So they're just exploring all of that space. Then they get an opportunity where you block off the route that goes to A and the route that goes to D, and you open up the route that goes to C. And now for the first time, they're experiencing this pathway to C, and they only experience it from starting from B and moving to C. And once they've had that experience, then what the Roberts et al. Did was put rats in C at test. They saw some food there, but before they were able to eat the food, they were removed from box C, and they were placed into box D. Now, the pathway that normally had been open is closed, but two new pathways, one leading directly to A and one leading directly to C, were made available to the rats. And in this study, the rats overwhelmingly chose the pathway that led to C than the one that led to A, when they've experienced food in the end arm C prior to being placed in D. So now to look at this, how do we explain this kind of inference of which pathway, novel pathway to take? How do we explain this in terms of both the Hopi model I was just talking about versus the Tolman and especially O'Keefe and Nadell hippocampal cognitive map model? So according to Hopi, in the first phase, the rats have built direct vectors between D and B, D in the center, B in the center, and A in the center. All of these spaces that are shown here that they have direct access to. Now, because they have direct access to A and B through this route, they can derive a vector that if they were in B, they should be able to, let's say, like if they were a human and the human was placed in B and say, point to where A is, and they would just point in that direction. That's kind of the knowledge that we're talking about is being acquired. That's direct, that's vector knowledge. Likewise, there's a derived vector between D and A. Then in the second phase of this study, where rats were placed in B, they can navigate to C. What they add to that is they get both these direct vectors because they are directly traveling that route. They presumably acquired this derived vector. And because they have all of these derived vectors and the direct vectors here, they can also derive a vector. Now we call this a second order derived vector between D and C. And because of having that second order derived vector, when they're placed, when they're shown that there's food in C and then placed directly in D, and now only these two pathways are open up, they have all the knowledge they need about where C is relative to D. Even though they've never directly traveled that route, the inference should be there based on these integrated vector knowledge. So, and I just basically what I said in the bottom, wrote in the bottom is what I just said. And in so this is just this is a reproduction from one of our figures explaining what I just talked about on the previous slide and comparing that to the place cell based cognitive map. place cells are only present for familiar locations. So because place cells, these circles here are indicating like where place cells might be. So if you're recording from the hippocampus of the rat while it's navigating this maze and it's a place they've navigated before, you'll see that certain neurons in the hippocampus reliably increase firing rate when the rat is in one of these specific locations. And those are called place cells. But what you see is that if the rat had all the experiences we just talked about in the Roberts study, and then they're shown that there's food in C, and then they're placed in D, and two novel routes are opened up, nothing in these place cells should enable them to figure out which of these two pathways to take, because there are no place cells along these pathways. They're novel pathways, so there are no cells that encode those places. So spatial inferences actually don't seem to be able to be supported by a place cell type theory like O'Keefe and Nadel proposed, but rather requires some more integration of bottom-up information that could be used to compute vectors in that Cartesian space. So while historically there have been these warring sides between behaviorism with the stimulus response, associative learning, and path integration, things like that, versus the cognitivist side from cognitive maps and the hippocampal instantiation of that for vertebrates. I argue that spatial knowledge has the following properties. Spatial vectors can be acquired through path integration, both egocentric, moving through space, or allocentric, where your eyes or your head moves through space through the visual field. Higher order associative processes can integrate those vectors into a larger coherent architecture. We'll call this integrated spatial knowledge. And that spatial inferences are the product of this top-down computations derived from integrated spatial knowledge. Spatial knowledge can be, but in our view, need not be explicitly map-like. It's not like you close your eyes or the rats close their eyes and they have a map of the layout. That's the Tolmanian idea. It could be that the knowledge is there, but it's not in an explicit form. It's in a more implicit knowledge. That's an implicit encoding of metric relations. So given this kind of approach that we're trying to argue for, the remaining questions for future episodes are: what are the conditions by which spatial knowledge is acquired? When does integration occur is a kind of a critical question. And there's not been much work on this, but Michael Mollet has suggested that maybe it's at the time of test that the spatial knowledge, or the integrated spatial knowledge is taking place. And a human example might be, you stop somebody for directions and say, which way is it to that supermarket? And the person might say, well, actually, it's a good question. I've never gone from where I'm now to that supermarket, but I think it's probably that way. You have this sense that it may be about that way, about a half a mile, right? That'd be kind of the knowledge that's in there, but it's not really explicit until it's being probed. And then the derivation process to compute a novel route can be taken at that point. And the final question: how do brain systems support these various functions, encoding, retrieval, integration, inference, etc., that operate on different kinds of information? There are paths and routes, there are landmarks, there are global cues, gradients, and things like that. And finally, the comparative analysis, the computational analyses, neural mechanisms, because we know that the neural mechanisms in invertebrates will not be homologous to those in invertebrates because they don't have homologous brain structures, but the computational processes might be homologous through independent evolution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Aaron. We already have a question. I don't know if Alex wants to ask him live. Can I give you access to talk if you want?
Yeah, just happy to ask it. First, it's only a question of detail because I don't remember the Roberts et al. Experiment from before. And the question is whether the rats can trial by trial, if you bait either C or A, you get the animals to choose the right one from one trial to the next, or what you presented was the aggregate of always training a given animal to go to C, say, or exclusively to A. I mean, did they show flexibility in the way they use their map?
Right. That's, it's been a while since I read it's been a year since I read the Roberts study carefully. So I'm trying to remember that detail. There's a good, important point. Can an individual rat either be biased to go towards C or towards A, depending on what the most recent experience was of, oh, I just saw food in C, I know to go that way, or I saw food in A. I don't remember if they did that level of probing.
We all have to go and read it again. But the other question attached to that, and then I'll shut up, is whether, I mean, the fact that Tolman showed that this knowledge was formed in the absence of reinforcement, but what you are describing is reinforcement of specific paths and then integration of that. Am I right in this difference?
No, actually, no. I'm sorry if I gave that impression. I'm not talking about reinforcement of these paths. It's more about exposure to the paths. So just traveling along them they should acquire that knowledge. There, I agree with Tolman. I think there's good evidence that without explicit reinforcement, there's other aspects of what leads to learning, curiosity, exploration. But that knowledge can prove, rather than building in a top-down cognitive map in a way we think of, oh, I could just draw that space from a top-down view. It's more like it's more of an embedded knowledge. And when you think about from any starting point where something is, you might have a sense as to where it is based on the spatial representation, the spatial knowledge you've acquired, and what can be inferred from that.
Thank you. Just thank you.
Awesome. Good questions, Alex. Does Federico have his hand up?
Oh, hi, Aaron. Fantastic talk, by the way. And it reminded me of some work that perhaps you, but certainly other folks in Ralph Miller's lab did, years ago, about kind of like something analogous, but on the temporal dimension. And
that's what started everything for me with the spatial dimension, with the actual experiments I did. Yes.
Right, but and that kind of work of like temporal coding and all that stuff was mostly about like simple path integration. What will be here like simple path integration, right? But now the Roberts study, brings up this notion that at least new to me, the possibility that you can integrate these derived paths and create this second order kind of paths. And I wonder if that is unique to space because it has, two dimensions, at least more than one, or is that something that could be analogous, something analogous could happen on the temporal dimension?
Well, wouldn't you say that that some of Ralph's work and then one study in my lab consistent with that did actually show that it's like a second order conditioning or a sensory preconditioning procedure, that there's this integration of temporal maps, and wouldn't that be akin to in time what's going on here in space?
Well, it looks very much like that simple path integration. I don't remember the letters in the maze for the Roberts study, but that you go up and left, and then you figure out, oh, if I go diagonally, I could cut. I mean, if there was a path that was diagonal, I could cut, and get there sooner. But the fact that you can infer those more direct paths, and on the basis of those more direct paths, figure out, oh, there's a new path perhaps leading that you haven't derived before, that could emerge from integrating those derived paths. That's the part that I thought that's particularly impressive about.
That's the part. That's another part that needs to be tested. Exactly. Can you take just derived vectors, derived knowledge, and combine different only derive knowledge and get yet another piece of higher order knowledge that could be acted on. Yeah, that needs to be tested.
And ultimately, and I know that you said that that there is no explicit, that an explicit representation of,
not necessarily.
It's not necessary, right? It's not necessary to form this for this derivations to happen, for these paths to be figured out. But ultimately, if you once you derive all of the relations between these different locations, wouldn't that ultimately be the map that emerges from that you ultimately get a map of the maybe the incomplete map, but a map of the situation that you're in? That it's not necessarily for you to solve the problem, but it emerges from you solving the problem.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Maps can be. I think maps can be formed. Humans, obviously, we do show ability to form maps, and we can draw relatively accurate depictions of routes and places and map-like knowledge. What I'm trying to challenge is that that's not necessary for these spatial inferences. It's not that you build the map so that you can make spatial inferences, but that's more of a one possible. When you have enough knowledge, you might be able to make it explicit, but you don't need that level of knowledge, of that level of representation, in order to derive novel inferences about novel routes, shortcuts, etc.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're running out of time. So thank you again, Aaron, for your talk and all the attendees for being here. We'll see you in a few minutes in the next talk.
All right.
Bye-bye.